The rhythmic clatter of the iron wheels on the track was a heartbeat, a steady, relentless pulse counting away the miles across the vast, sun-scorched expanse of the New Mexico territory. Heat shimmered above the red earth, turning the distant mesas into wavering, dreamlike shapes against a bleached blue sky. Inside the last car of the westbound train, the air was thick with the scent of coal smoke, hot metal, and the fine dust that seeped through every crack in the wooden walls. It was a lonely, forgotten space, a place for baggage and for men who didn't care for company. Jedediah Mercer was such a man. He sat on a hard-planked bench, a tall, broad-shouldered figure whose stillness seemed a part of the landscape itself. He wasn't looking out the window, not with any real interest. He had seen this country for more years than he cared to count. The sun had tanned his skin to the color of worn leather and etched fine lines around eyes the color of a faded sky. His hat, a dusty Stetson, was tipped low, shadowing a face that gave away nothing. His hands, calloused and capable, rested on his knees. Over his worn shirt and leather vest, he wore a heavy canvas duster, a practical garment against the desert's unforgiving sun by day and its biting cold by night. He was a man carved from the silence and the hardship of the frontier, and he was perfectly at peace within its embrace. The steady rock and sway of the train was a familiar cradle, the clatter of the wheels a song he had long ago learned the words to. The spell was broken by a sudden, jarring noise. The door at the front of the car was thrown open with a crash, letting in a blinding slice of daylight and a frantic gust of hot wind. It was slammed shut just as quickly, the latch rattling into place with a sound of desperate finality. Jed didn't move, save for a slow lift of his head. His eyes, missing nothing, took in the figure now leaning against the door, chest heaving with ragged, panicked breaths. It was a girl, though it was hard to tell her age beneath the grime and the terror. Her face was smudged with dirt and streaked with the clean paths of recent tears. Her dress, once a simple calico, was torn at the shoulder and hemmed with the filth of hard travel. In her hand, she clutched a small cloth bag as if it were the only solid thing in a world that was crumbling around her. But it was her eyes that held him. They were wide and wild, the color of a stormy sea, darting around the empty car like a cornered rabbit searching for an escape where none existed. They scanned the dusty floors, the stacked crates, the vacant benches, and then they found him. For a moment, her panic was overlaid with a new kind of fear. She was not alone. She had trapped herself in this box of steel and wood with a stranger, a man whose sheer size and silence were an unknown quantity, another potential threat in a day that had been full of them. She stayed pressed against the door, her knuckles white where she gripped the handle. The train swayed, and she stumbled, catching herself against the wall. He could hear her breathing, a series of short, sharp gasps that spoke of a terror so profound it had stolen the very air from her lungs. He remained perfectly still, watching her, letting her see that he was no immediate threat. He made no move to stand, no gesture of inquiry. He simply waited. In the West, you learned to read a situation before you acted, and this situation was a whirlwind of unspoken trouble. After a long, agonizing moment, a decision seemed to form behind her frightened eyes. She had no other choice. Pushing herself off the door, she took a hesitant step toward him, then another. Her movements were stiff, her body coiled as if ready to bolt at the slightest provocation. She stopped a few feet away, her gaze fixed on his shadowed face. He could see the pulse beating frantically in the hollow of her throat. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, a dry, raspy sound that was almost lost in the noise of the train. "Don't let them see me," she breathed, the words tumbling out on a desperate exhale. She took another small step closer, her eyes pleading. "Please, I'll just sit under your coat. They won't look there. I won't be any trouble." Jedediah looked at her. He saw the torn dress, the raw fear that made her tremble, the desperate hope that was fighting a losing battle against it. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask who they were or why they were after her. The answers were written all over her. Trouble had a certain look, and this girl was wearing it like a shroud. Questions were a luxury, and time was something she clearly did not have. His expression didn't change. He offered no words of comfort, no smile of reassurance. His response was a simple, silent action. He shifted his weight, a subtle movement of his large frame, and with one hand, he lifted the edge of his heavy duster. The canvas fabric parted, creating a dark, cramped space between his body and the wall of the train car. It was not an offer of comfort. It was an offer of sanctuary, a small, temporary patch of invisibility in a world that was hunting her. Relief washed over her face, so potent it almost brought her to her knees. She didn't hesitate. She scrambled forward, ducking under the heavy fabric and pressing herself into the corner. She curled into a tight ball on the floor, her knees drawn up to her chest, making herself as small as humanly possible. The space was tight, filled with the scent of dust, worn leather, and the faint, clean smell of the man himself. It was terrifyingly close. Yet it was the only shelter she had. The canvas fell back into place, plunging her into a dim, stifling darkness. Outside her makeshift haven, Jed settled back into his previous posture, the duster now draping slightly unevenly over the hidden form at his feet. To any casual observer, he was just a large man resting on a bench. He folded his arms over his chest, his gaze fixed on the door she had come through, and he waited. He didn't have to wait long. The sound came from the next car, forward the heavy thud of boots on the connecting platform, followed by a rough, angry voice shouting commands. The door to their car was wrenched open, not with the frantic haste of the girl, but with an arrogant, violent force. 3 men filled the doorway, their shapes dark against the bright sun. They paused for a moment, letting their eyes adjust to the gloom. The man in the lead was stout, his face florid and sweating under a bowler hat that sat too small on his head. He wore a garish brocade vest over a stained shirt, and his mouth was set in a cruel, determined line. The 2 men flanking him were cut from a rougher cloth, their faces blank and brutish, their hands resting near the pistols holstered at their hips. They were hounds, and the man in the vest held their leash. "Search it," the leader grunted, his eyes sweeping the car. His men moved with a practiced, ugly efficiency. They kicked at crates, overturned a stack of empty sacks, their movements filled with a casual disregard for property. They were not looking for a lost item. They were hunting a person. The leader's gaze, however, fell upon the single, still figure at the far end of the car. He watched Jed for a long moment, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features that anyone would dare to remain so calm in his presence. He started down the narrow aisle, his boots making loud, deliberate thuds on the wooden floorboards. He was a man who used his physical presence to intimidate, to create an aura of menace that usually got him what he wanted without a fight. He stopped a few feet from Jed, his thumbs hooked into his vest. "You," he said, his voice a low growl. "You see a girl come through here young, with dark hair, in a torn dress." Jed did not move. He slowly, deliberately, lifted his head, letting his gaze meet the other man's. His eyes, clear and steady, held no fear, no anger, no emotion at all. It was a flat, unnerving stare. It was the look of a mountain that has endured 1,000 storms and remains unmoved. A look that did not challenge, but simply stated a fact. "I am here. I've seen nothing that concerns you," Jed said. His voice was low and even, calm as a deep river, yet it carried across the car with absolute clarity. The leader's face darkened. He was not used to being dismissed. "That ain't what I asked. I asked if you saw her." "And I gave you my answer." Beneath the coat, Clara held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she was sure the whole car could hear it. She pressed her face into her knees, praying for an end to it, one way or another. The stout man took another step closer, trying to loom over the seated cowboy. It was a wasted effort, even sitting. Jed seemed to fill the space, an immovable object of quiet resolve. "Maybe you need some persuading," the man sneered, letting his hand drop to the butt of his own pistol. "She's my property, stole from me. I mean to have her back." Jed's eyes flickered down to the man's hand, then back up to his face. The absolute lack of fear in his gaze was more potent than any threat. He had faced men like this before. Bullies who relied on noise and bluster, whose courage was only as strong as their opponent's fear. And Jedediah Mercer was not afraid. He was a man who had been pared down to his essential self by the unforgiving frontier, and what was left was as hard and unyielding as granite. He didn't need to draw his gun. He didn't need to raise his voice. His stillness was his weapon. He held the leader's gaze, and in that silent, protracted moment, a battle was fought and won. The man in the vest saw something in Jed's eyes that gave him pause. He saw a line drawn in the dust, and he saw the quiet certainty of a man who would die before he allowed it to be crossed. This was not some farmer to be cowed or some drunk to be beaten. This was something older, something more dangerous. The brutish confidence in the leader's face began to waver, replaced by a flicker of doubt, then of grudging respect for a predator he did not wish to challenge. He finally broke eye contact, glancing away with a frustrated grunt. He had lost, and he knew it, but his pride would not let him admit it. "She's not here," he spat out, turning to his men as if the thought had just occurred to him. "Wasted enough time. She must have jumped from the train back a ways. Let's go." His men, who had been watching the silent confrontation with dull curiosity, simply nodded and followed him back toward the door. The leader shot one last, hateful glare at Jed before stepping out onto the platform. The door slammed shut, and the sound of their heavy boots faded as they moved on. Silence descended once more, thick and heavy. The only sound was the familiar, comforting rhythm of the wheels on the track. Under the coat, Clara let out a shuddering breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Tears of relief streamed down her face, soaking the rough fabric of her dress. She remained curled in her ball of darkness, trembling uncontrollably from the aftermath of her terror. Jed did not move. He waited. He listened to the train, to the silence, for a full minute, then another. Only when he was certain they were truly gone, that the danger had passed for now, did he allow his body to relax. He uncrossed his arms and shifted slightly on the bench. It was a small, subtle movement, but for the girl hidden in the darkness, it was a signal. The storm had passed. For now, she was safe. The heavy canvas of the duster fell away, and Clara stumbled out into the dim light of the railcar, blinking like a creature unused to the sun. The air she gulped was thick with dust, but it was free, and she drank it in. She looked up at the man who had sheltered her, his face an unreadable map of shadows under the brim of his hat. He had not betrayed her. He had faced down the danger and had not flinched. A fragile seed of gratitude, so foreign it was almost painful, tried to take root in the barren soil of her fear. She hugged her small cloth bag to her chest, the worn fabric a poor substitute for a shield. Her trembling had not ceased. It was a deep, internal shudder, a tremor in her very soul that the passing of the immediate threat had done nothing to calm. The adrenaline that had propelled her onto the train and into this stranger's care was now leaving her, replaced by a cold, hollow dread. They knew she was on the train. They were not men to give up easily. They would search again. They would be more thorough. Her voice, when she found it, was a thin, ragged thread of sound, barely audible over the clatter of the wheels. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling inadequate, clumsy. She looked toward the door her pursuers had exited, her eyes wide with a terror that was now less frantic and more profound. "If they find me—" She swallowed hard, the dust in her throat making it difficult to speak. Her gaze fell to the floor, unable to meet the cowboy's steady eyes. "It won't be quick. What they'll do, they'll make me wish they'd just killed me." Jedediah watched her, his expression unchanging. He heard the truth in her voice. the stark, unvarnished certainty of a person who has looked into the abyss and knows its depths. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a gesture of pity or sympathy. It was an acknowledgement of fact. He had seen the leader's face, the proprietary cruelty in his eyes. He had seen the brutishness of his men. He did not doubt her words for a second. The world was full of men who found sport in breaking things, especially things that were small and alive. He turned his head slightly. His attention focused not on her, but on the sounds of the train. He was listening. His entire being concentrated on the rhythms and noises that traveled through the steel and wood. He was a man accustomed to listening to the world around him, the snap of a twig that meant a deer, the shift in the wind that meant a storm. Now, he listened for the telltale sounds of men. For a long while, there was nothing but the steady, monotonous song of the rails. The sun beat down on the roof of the car, turning the air inside into a stifling oven. Clara's breathing slowly evened out, though the trembling in her hands remained. She slid down to sit on the dusty floor, her back against the bench, too exhausted to stand. The silence stretched, thin and taut. Perhaps they had given up. Perhaps they truly believed she had jumped. Then he heard it. It was a subtle change in the rhythm, a heavy, jarring thud from the car ahead, different from the train's regular motion. It was the sound of a man jumping across the coupling. It was followed by another, and another. They were coming back. Jed's body tensed. He didn't look at Clara, but he saw her out of the corner of his eye. She had heard it too. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin a pasty, sickly white. The fleeting hope in her eyes was extinguished, replaced by a final, bottomless despair. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. A voice, rough and angry, carried through the thin wooden partition. "I tell you, he was lying. That stone-faced bastard was hiding her. We search this last car again. Tear it apart if we have to." The heavy latch on the connecting door rattled violently. They were trying to force it. In that instant, every trace of languor vanished from Jedediah Mercer. He moved with a speed and purpose that was startling in a man so large. He did not waste a motion. He did not waste a breath. While Clara was frozen in a paralysis of terror, he was a coiled spring of action. His hand shot out and gripped her upper arm. The hold was like iron, not cruel but absolute. It pulled her to her feet as if she weighed nothing. Her small bag fell from her grasp, forgotten on the floor. Her mind, numb with shock, could barely process what was happening. He was dragging her, not toward the front of the car where the men were, but toward the wide cargo door on the side. "What are you?" she started to stammer, but the words died in her throat. He wasn't listening. He was already working the latch on the heavy sliding door. It was rusted and stiff, designed to be opened from the outside. His jaw was set, the muscles in his forearms cording with the effort as he fought the stubborn mechanism. Behind them, the wood of the front door splintered as a heavy boot crashed against it. With a final, agonized groan of protesting metal, the latch gave way. Jed slid the heavy door open just enough for them to squeeze through, and the world exploded into a cacophony of sound and motion. The roar of the wind was deafening, snatching the air from their lungs. The ground below was a rushing, blurred streak of ochre and gray, a river of rock and sand flowing past at a terrifying speed. The heat was a physical blow, a blast from a furnace. Clara shrank back, her mind reeling from the vertigo. Jump! It was suicide. The ground was a meat grinder waiting to tear them apart. Behind them, the front door of the car burst open, crashing against the interior wall. The stout man and his two brutes filled the doorway, their faces contorted with triumphant rage. "There she is!" the leader roared over the wind. They started toward them, their steps unsteady on the swaying floor. There was nowhere left to run. Jed looked from the advancing men to the terrifying blur of the desert floor. There was no decision to be made, only a choice between a certain ugly end and a slim, violent chance. He turned his head and looked directly at Clara for the first time. His sky-blue eyes were clear, intense, and held not a trace of fear. He was not asking her. He was telling her. His voice was a low, powerful command, cutting through the roar of the wind. "Hold on to me." He didn't wait for an answer. He didn't give her time to think, to scream, to protest. His arm, strong as an oak limb, wrapped around her waist, pulling her tight against his side. He held her so firmly she felt like a part of him, their bodies a single unit against the chaos. She had a fleeting impression of his sheer, solid strength, of the unyielding wall of his chest against her cheek. And then he jumped. For a terrifying, heart-stopping second, there was nothing but air. The train was gone, a thunderous iron beast shrinking behind them. There was only the vast, empty sky above and the rushing, unforgiving earth below. Clara squeezed her eyes shut. A silent scream trapped in her throat. She clung to him, her fingers digging into the tough canvas of his duster. This silent stranger, her only anchor in a world that had dissolved into a violent, roaring blur. The impact was not a landing. It was a collision. They hit the ground with a brutal, bone-jarring force that knocked the breath from their bodies in a single, painful gasp. The world became a tumble of pain and confusion. They rolled, over and over, a tangled mess of limbs through sand, sharp rocks, and thorny scrub brush. Clara felt a searing pain in her shoulder as it scraped against a stone, another on her knee. The rough fabric of Jed's coat was the only thing that saved her from being flayed open. Dust filled her mouth, her nose, her eyes. Finally, the violent momentum slowed, and they slid to a ragged halt in a shallow ditch, hidden by a scraggly mesquite bush. For a long moment, there was no sound but the frantic, ragged panting of their own breath and the ringing in their ears. Clara lay sprawled on the hard ground, every inch of her body screaming in protest. Her head spun. She tasted blood and dirt. She was alive. The realization was slow to dawn, a faint light in a fog of pain. Jed pushed himself up first, moving with a pained stiffness that betrayed his own injuries. A long scratch ran down his cheek, welling with blood. His duster was torn. His hands scraped raw. He ignored it all. His first instinct was survival. He scanned the landscape, his eyes tracking the train as it snaked its way west, a thin line of black smoke smudging the pristine sky. It grew smaller and smaller, its rhythmic clatter fading until it was finally swallowed by the immense silence of the desert. They were alone. He looked down at Clara. She was pushing herself up onto her elbows, her hair a wild tangle, her face streaked with dirt and a single trickle of blood from a cut on her temple. Her dress was in tatters. She looked bruised, battered, and utterly terrified, but she was whole. He reached down and, without a word, took her arm and pulled her to her feet. She swayed, her legs unsteady, and leaned against him for a moment to find her balance. The sun was a great bleeding orb on the western horizon, setting the sky ablaze. The clouds were painted in violent strokes of orange, crimson, and deep purple. The light spilled across the desert floor, transforming the desolate landscape into a place of stark, savage beauty. The distant mesas were no longer hazy shapes, but sharp, black silhouettes against the fire. The long shadows of the saguaro cacti stretched out like skeletal fingers, pointing the way into the encroaching twilight. Jed looked toward the distant, rugged mountains, their peaks turning a deep, bruised purple in the dying light. That was their only hope. Shelter, water, a place to disappear. He started walking, his long strides measured and deliberate despite his aches. After a moment's hesitation, Clara limped after him. They didn't speak. There were no words for what had just happened, no words for the vast, empty wilderness that now surrounded them, no words for the uncertain future that lay ahead. There was only the crunch of their boots on the gravel, the whisper of the wind through the sagebrush, and the two small, solitary figures moving as one, fleeing into the heart of the burning red sunset, The last rays of the sun bled away, and the desert's brief, spectacular beauty was replaced by a chilling, predatory darkness. The temperature dropped with shocking speed. The heat of the day sucked from the earth, leaving behind a cold that seeped into their bones. Every scrape and bruise from their violent landing now throbbed with a dull, insistent ache. The silence was immense. A physical weight broken only by the whisper of the wind and the crunch of their own footsteps on the loose rock. Jedediah moved with a steady, ground-eating pace, his eyes constantly scanning the dark, broken landscape. He was no stranger to this world. He knew that the night belonged to the hunter, and tonight they were the hunted. He led them away from the tracks, not in a straight line, but in a winding, deliberate path, using the contours of the land, the shallow arroyos and patches of thorny scrub to obscure their trail. He was a man reading a language written in shadow and stone, and Clara followed in his wake, a ghost of a figure trying to match his relentless stride. Her own body was a symphony of pain. Her ankle, twisted in the fall, sent a sharp protest up her leg with every step. The thin leather of her shoes, meant for town streets, was no match for the sharp rocks of the desert floor. She stumbled often, catching herself with a pained gasp. Her hands scraped raw, but she did not complain. She did not ask him to slow down. She understood, with a primal certainty, that to stop was to die. So she bit her lip, tasting the coppery tang of blood, and forced her screaming muscles to obey. After what felt like an eternity, Jed stopped. He held up a hand, a silent command for her to halt and stay quiet. He stood perfectly still, his head tilted, listening not with his ears, but with his entire body. Clara held her breath, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She strained to hear what he heard, but there was nothing. Only the vast, empty silence. Jed, however, was not listening for sound. He was feeling for vibrations in the earth, watching for the faintest pinprick of a lantern's light in the far distance. He knew the men from the train would not simply continue on their way. They would force the conductor to stop. They would backtrack. They were on foot now, just like them. But they would be hunting with a purpose, their rage a hot coal driving them on. He turned and moved again, his pace quicker now. He led her toward a low-lying area where the dry grass grew thick and tall, a pale, ghostly sea under the light of a sliver of moon. He stopped again in the center of the densest patch. Clara watched, confused, as he knelt down. From a small leather pouch on his belt, he produced a flint and steel. The action was so practiced, so economical. It was clear he had done it 1,000 times before. He didn't explain. He didn't look at her. He simply struck the flint against the steel. Once, twice. A small shower of sparks fell into the tinder-dry grass at his feet. A tiny orange spark caught, glowed, and then, with a soft whoosh, a small flame sprang to life. For a moment, Clara's heart seized with panic. Fire! It was a beacon. It would draw them right to them. She opened her mouth to protest, but the word died on her lips as she watched him work. He didn't build a campfire for warmth. He fed the flame, letting it catch on the surrounding stalks. And then he stood back. The wind, which had been their enemy, now became their ally. It whipped the small flame into a hungry, crackling line of fire that began to spread with astonishing speed. Within moments, a thick, acrid plume of white smoke was billowing upwards, a great ghostly pillar rising into the night sky. The wind caught it and smeared it eastward, back in the direction of the railroad tracks, creating a vast, shifting curtain of haze that would be visible for miles. He had created a lie, a misdirection. He was telling their pursuers, "We went this way." He grabbed her arm, his touch firm but not rough, and pulled her away from the growing blaze. "Come on," he said, his first words to her since his command to hold on. The sound of his voice, low and rough, was startling in the immense quiet. They ran. They half stumbled, half scrambled away from the fire, plunging deeper into the darkness. moving toward the looming, jagged silhouettes of the mountains. The fire behind them grew, casting a flickering, demonic orange glow against the smoke, a false dawn in the middle of the night. It was a brilliant, desperate gambit, and it bought them time. The terrain grew steeper, the flat desert floor giving way to the broken, treacherous foothills of the mountains. The climb was brutal. It was no longer walking, but a grueling, hand-over-hand struggle up steep inclines of loose shale that slid and shifted under their feet. The air grew thin and cold. Clara's lungs burned, each breath a searing, painful effort. Her legs felt like lead, her muscles trembling with an exhaustion so profound it was a physical sickness. Jed moved ahead of her, a dark, tireless shape against the star-dusted sky. He seemed to be part of the mountain itself, his movements sure and steady, as if he knew every rock, every foothold. He never looked back, but she knew he was aware of her every faltering step, his pace always just enough ahead to pull her forward, to keep her from giving up. At last, when Clara felt she could not take another step, that she would simply lie down on the cold stones and let whatever came for her come, he stopped. He had found what he was looking for. It was not a cave, but a narrow fissure in a great wall of black rock, a crack in the mountain's face, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. It was dark, hidden, and defensible. He slipped inside first, then reached back for her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers, and pulled her in after him. The space inside was no more than a deep, narrow cleft, perhaps 10 feet long and only a few feet wide. The rock walls rose up high above them, almost meeting overhead, leaving only a thin, jagged ribbon of starry sky visible. The wind howled over the opening, but inside the fissure, the air was still and deathly cold. It was a tomb. It was a sanctuary. Jed released her hand and moved to the entrance, positioning himself so he could watch their back trail without being seen. He sank down to a crouch, his body melting into the shadows, becoming just another piece of the rock. The moment the forward momentum ceased, the moment they were still, the fragile dam of Clara's control finally broke. The strength that had carried her through the chase, the escape, the grueling climb, simply evaporated. A great shuddering sob escaped her, a raw, wounded sound that was torn from the very depths of her being. She slid down the cold, unforgiving rock wall, her legs giving way completely, and curled into a miserable heap on the ground. The tears came then, hot and unstoppable. They were not tears of self-pity, but of sheer, gut-wrenching despair. She wept for the life that had been stolen from her, for the innocence that had been brutalized, for the terrifying, uncertain future that stretched before her like an endless desert. She wept from the pain in her body and the deeper, unhealable pain in her soul, and she wept from a confusion so profound it made her head spin. She looked at the silent figure crouched at the entrance, a man who had, for no discernible reason, thrown his own life into the path of her trouble. He had sheltered her, faced down her enemies, and thrown himself from a moving train, all for a complete stranger. It made no sense. In her world, men did not help. They took, they used, they discarded. Kindness was a foreign language she had never heard spoken. Through her choked sobs, she finally voiced the question that had been screaming in her mind. Why? The word was a broken whisper. She pushed herself up slightly, her tear-streaked face pale in the faint starlight that filtered into their hiding place. Why are you helping me? Jedediah did not turn around. His posture did not change. He remained a silent, unmoving guardian at the mouth of their stone sanctuary. The wind howled outside, a lonely, mournful sound that seemed to mock her question. For a long, tense moment, he said nothing. The silence stretched, and in it, Clara felt the foolishness of her question. What answer could he possibly give? What answer would she even believe? But then, he moved. He didn't speak. He simply reached back without looking, his hand holding out his canteen. It was a simple, practical gesture. It was an answer devoid of words. It said, "You are thirsty. Drink." It said, "Survival comes first. The reasons can wait." She took the canteen, her trembling fingers brushing against his. The metal was cool against her skin. She drank greedily, the cool water a balm to her raw throat. The simple act of quenching her thirst seemed to ground her, to pull her back from the edge of her despair. After a while, he made a low sound. It was time to move again. Their pursuers might have been fooled by the fire, but they would not be fooled for long. They needed to get higher, deeper into the mountains, before dawn. He helped her to her feet. The narrow fissure was dark, and the ground was slick with moisture that had seeped from the rock. As she took a step, her worn-out shoe slipped on a patch of wet stone. Her ankle, already weak, gave way completely. She cried out, a small, sharp sound of pain and surprise, as she fell. But she did not hit the ground. His arms shot out, quick as a striking snake, and wrapped around her waist, catching her and pulling her upright against him. His strength was absolute, his reflex instantaneous. For a dizzying second, she was pressed against the solid wall of his chest, her face just inches from his. The heat of his body was a stark contrast to the cold night air. She could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart through his shirt. Her own heart was hammering. She looked up, and for the first time, she truly looked into his eyes. They were not obscured by the shadow of his hat now. In the faint, ethereal starlight, she could see them clearly. They were the color of a winter sky, pale and clear, and in their depths, she saw what she had been so desperate to understand. It was not curiosity. There was no prying inquiry there, no morbid desire to know the sordid details of her past. There was no judgment, no pity, no condescension. What she saw was something far rarer, something she had never encountered in a man's gaze before. She saw understanding. It was not a specific knowledge of her circumstances. He couldn't know about her father, about the saloon owner, about the years of being treated as less than human. It was a deeper, more fundamental recognition. It was the quiet, weary acknowledgement of a fellow soul who knew that the world was a hard, sharp-edged place. It was the look of a man who had seen his own share of pain, of loss, of struggle, and recognized its reflection in her. His eyes held the vast, lonely patience of the mountains themselves. They didn't offer comfort or promise that things would be all right. They simply said, "I see you, I see your struggle, and I am still here." In that one, silent look, a profound shift occurred within her. The terror that had been her constant companion began, for the first time, to recede. It was replaced by something new, something fragile and tentative, yet more powerful than any fear. It was trust. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his story. But she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that this silent man would not harm her. He had answered her question without saying a single word. They traveled through the night and into the gray, pre-dawn light, a moving tableau of exhaustion and grim determination. The mountains had given them cover, but they had extracted a heavy price. By the time the sun's first weak rays crested the eastern peaks, Clara felt as if she were made of nothing but frayed nerves and screaming muscles. Jedediah, a tireless silhouette ahead of her, finally led them out of the maze of canyons and onto a high plateau that overlooked a vast, sweeping valley. He stopped, and she came to a halt beside him, leaning against a weathered pinnacle of rock to keep from collapsing. She followed his gaze down into the valley below. At first, she saw nothing but a continuation of the harsh, unforgiving landscape. But then, as her eyes adjusted, she saw it, tucked into a curve of the land, sheltered by a low mesa that protected it from the worst of the wind, was a small, solitary homestead. It was not a picturesque ranch. There was no whitewashed fence, no cheerful farmhouse. It was a place of brutal honesty. built not for comfort but for survival. A small, sturdy cabin of scarred timber and mud chinking hunkered low to the ground, its roof a patchwork of sod and rough-hewn planks. A small barn, built with the same rugged functionality, stood nearby, connected by a simple corral made of gnarled juniper posts. A stone-lined well, with a simple wooden windlass, marked the property's lifeblood. The place looked less like it had been built upon the land, and more like it had grown out of it. As stubborn and resilient as the scrub oak that clung to the hillsides, it was the most isolated, lonely place Clara had ever seen. And yet, there was an undeniable strength to it, a sense of permanence, of a line drawn against the wilderness that had not been erased. Jed started down the long, sloping path into the valley, his steps sure and familiar. This was his place. This was the fortress at the end of their desperate flight. Clara followed, her heart a confusion of relief and a new, formless anxiety. She had escaped her pursuers, but she had been led to a place that was, in its own way, just as intimidating. It was the home of the silent man who had saved her, and she was an intruder, a piece of trouble that had washed up on his doorstep. As they drew closer, the details of the homestead became clearer. A small, hardy-looking vegetable patch, fenced with chicken wire to keep out the rabbits and deer, grew near the cabin. A lone horse, a sturdy-looking buckskin, lifted its head from the corral and gave a low nicker of greeting. There was a sense of order here, of a life lived by the rhythms of work and seasons. They were 20 yards from the cabin door when it happened. The door, which had been closed, creaked open a few inches. For a moment, nothing. Then, a small figure slipped out with the quick, silent grace of a fox. It was a boy, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, with a tangled mop of sun-bleached hair and feet that were bare and tough as leather. He wore a simple, homespun shirt and trousers that were patched at the knees. He didn't run to greet Jed. He stopped by the corner of the cabin, partially concealed, and simply watched them approach. His eyes, wide and startlingly blue in his sun-browned face, filled with a wary, animal-like caution. He was like a small, feral creature, a part of the wild landscape that had somehow found its way into a boy's skin. Jed stopped and gave the boy a slow, single nod. The boy watched him for a long moment, his gaze unblinking, and then he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod in return. It was a conversation without words, a greeting and an acknowledgement that passed between them in the quiet morning air. Then, the boy's intense gaze shifted to Clara. He looked her up and down, taking in her torn dress, her bruised and dirty face, her exhaustion. His expression held no welcome, only a deep, unnerving curiosity, the analytical stare of a creature assessing a new and unknown element in its territory. He was not afraid, but he was not friendly either. He was a sentinel. Jed walked past him to the cabin door and pushed it open, holding it for Clara. "Go on inside," he said. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, acutely aware of the boy's eyes on her back, before ducking into the cool dimness of the cabin. The inside was as simple and unadorned as the outside. It was a single room, dominated by a large stone fireplace that was clearly the heart of the home. A rough-hewn plank table and 2 stools stood in the center of the room. A bed, neatly made, was built into one corner. Shelves on the walls held a few tin plates, some basic provisions, and a small, worn collection of books. Everything was clean, ordered, and stripped down to its essential purpose. There was no sign of a woman's touch, no curtains on the single window, no rug on the packed earth floor. It was a man's world, a man's and a boy's. Jed came in behind her, letting the door fall shut. He went to the fireplace, where embers still glowed from the previous night, and added a few pieces of wood, coaxing them back to life. The boy slipped in after him and went to a small cot in the far corner, his own sleeping place, and sat down, his eyes never leaving Clara. Jed gestured to one of the stools at the table. "Sit," he said. "There's coffee." Clara sat, her body sinking onto the hard wood with a grateful sigh. She felt utterly out of place, a discordant note in the quiet harmony of this strange home. Jed moved with a familiar, quiet efficiency, adding water to a tin pot and setting it on a hook over the growing fire. He did not ask her questions. He did not ask her name. He simply provided for her immediate needs: shelter, a place to sit, the promise of a warm drink. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that was entirely new to Clara. It was a rhythm dictated not by fear or the cruel whims of others, but by the rising and setting of the sun, by the fundamental needs of survival. It was a life of silence. The boy, whose name she eventually learned was Caleb, did not speak to her at all for the first few days. He would watch her, his blue eyes following her every move, but he kept his distance. Jed spoke only when necessary, his words as spare and functional as the cabin itself. No one asked her about the men on the train. No one asked where she came from or why she had been running. Her past was a locked room, and, to her profound relief, no one in this silent, lonely place seemed interested in finding the key. They accepted her presence as they would accept a stray calf that had wandered into their valley, a new reality to be dealt with, not a mystery to be solved. For the first day, she did little more than sit, sleep, and eat the simple stew that Jed cooked. Her body was a landscape of aches and bruises, and her mind was numb. But on the second day, a deep, restless feeling began to stir within her. She could not just sit here. She could not be a useless burden. She had been treated as property, as a thing to be used, for so long that the idea of accepting charity without earning it felt deeply unsettling. She had to find a way to contribute, to have a purpose, however small. She started with the simplest of tasks. She saw Jed haul 2 heavy buckets of water from the well, his muscles straining. The next morning, she rose before him and went to the well herself. The bucket was heavier than she expected, the rope rough against her scraped hands. She managed to haul it halfway up before her strength gave out, the bucket plunging back down with a loud splash. A moment later, Jed was there. He didn't say a word. He didn't scold her or offer a condescending smile. He simply took the rope from her hands and, with a few easy pulls, brought the full bucket to the surface. He carried both buckets back to the cabin, but he had let her try. He had seen her intent. She found the small stack of firewood by the door was dwindling, so she ventured out to the edge of the tree line, gathering fallen branches. The work was hard. The wood was rough and left splinters in her hands. Her back ached, but there was a satisfaction in it, in the growing pile of wood she created. When she returned, Caleb was sitting on the cabin steps, whittling a piece of wood with a small knife. He watched her stack the wood, his expression unreadable. She discovered the small root cellar where they kept potatoes, onions, and carrots. She took them out and sat by the water barrel, scrubbing the thick dirt from their skins. It was a mindless, repetitive task, and she found a strange comfort in it. It was real. It was tangible. It was something she could do with her own 2 hands that resulted in something clean and useful. Slowly, cautiously, the silence between her and Caleb began to thaw. One afternoon, as she sat on the steps, mending a tear in her tattered dress with a needle and thread she'd found in a small box, Caleb approached. He didn't speak. He simply stopped a few feet away and held out his hand. In his palm was a small, crudely carved bird, its wings slightly lopsided. It was the piece of wood he had been whittling. She looked from the bird to his face. His expression was serious, his eyes fixed on her. It was an offering, a peace treaty. She reached out and took it, her fingers brushing his. The wood was smooth and warm from his hand. "Thank you, Caleb," she said softly. "It's beautiful." He gave a short, sharp nod, as if a business transaction had been completed, and then turned and ran off toward the corral, his silence still intact. But something had changed. He had spoken to her in his own way. She began to watch him more, to see the world he inhabited with Jed. Their bond was forged in the same silence that filled the valley. A shared glance across the dinner table was enough to communicate a whole thought. A hand gesture from Jed would send Caleb scrambling to open the corral gate. They moved around each other with an unspoken understanding, two parts of a single, self-sufficient organism. And as she watched, she began to heal. The physical work made her tired, a deep, honest exhaustion that brought a dreamless, restorative sleep she hadn't known in years. The quiet of the valley began to seep into her, calming the frantic, panicked noise that had lived in her head for so long. It was a silence that did not demand, but simply allowed. It gave her space to breathe, to think, to simply be. She was still afraid. The memory of the men on the train was a cold knot in her stomach, and she found herself scanning the rim of the valley, half expecting to see their dark figures silhouetted against the sky. But here, in this small, protected world, the fear was a distant echo, not a constant scream. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, she stood by the corral fence, watching Jed brush down the buckskin horse. Caleb sat on the top rail, a small, silent observer. The scene was so peaceful, so utterly normal. It made her ache. She realized that something was happening to her, something as slow and quiet as the shifting of the seasons. A bruised seed, thrown violently from a moving train, had landed in this unlikely, rocky soil. And against all odds, she could feel, deep within herself, the first tentative stirring of a root taking hold. It was not yet hope, not yet happiness. It was something more fundamental. It was the simple, profound, and utterly new feeling of being safe. Weeks bled into a month, and the sharp edges of Clara's fear began to soften, worn down by the steady, quiet rhythm of life in the valley. The homestead, once an intimidating symbol of isolation, had become a sanctuary. The vast, silent landscape was no longer a threat, but a guardian. Its towering mesas and deep canyons, a fortress wall between her and the world she had fled. She learned the language of the place the way the light changed on the canyon walls to mark the hours. The particular cry of a hawk that meant it had found prey. The smell of rain on the dry earth long before the first drop fell. Her hands, once soft, grew calloused and capable. She learned to mend the fences, to churn butter, to bake a passable loaf of bread in the stone fireplace. She and Caleb had forged their own silent language, a bond built on shared chores and small, gifted treasures, a smooth, colorful stone from the creek bed, a perfect eagle feather, the crudely carved figure of a horse. He was still a boy of few words, but his caution had been replaced by a quiet, fierce loyalty. He would often sit near her while she worked, a small, watchful shadow, and she found a strange, protective comfort in his presence. But as the days grew shorter and the nights colder, the quiet that had healed her also began to give her space to remember. The safety of the present threw the horror of the past into sharper relief, in the deep stillness of the evening. After Caleb was asleep on his cot and the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the sigh of the wind outside, the ghosts would return. One such evening, they were finishing the last of their chores. A chill was in the air, a promise of the coming winter, and they were working inside by the warm glow of a single kerosene lamp. Jed was mending a piece of tack, his large, skilled hands moving with a surgeon's precision. Clara was at the dry sink, a shallow wooden basin on a stand, washing the tin plates from their simple supper of rabbit stew. The silence in the cabin was a living thing, comfortable and deep, but tonight, for Clara, it was filled with echoes. As she scrubbed a plate, the reflection that looked back at her from the slick, wet surface was a stranger, a young woman with healthier color in her cheeks and a strength in her eyes that hadn't been there before. But the ghost of the other girl, the terrified, haunted creature from the train, was still there, lurking just beneath the surface. Her hand began to tremble, a memory, sharp and unwelcome as a shard of glass, pierced the fragile peace of the evening. She saw a different pair of hands, her own, scrubbing a grimy saloon floor. And she heard a man's voice, thick with whiskey and menace, telling her she'd missed a spot. The tin plate slipped from her grasp, clattering loudly into the basin with a jarring clang that shattered the cabin's quiet. Jed looked up from his work, his hands stilling. He didn't speak, but his gaze was a question. Clara snatched the plate up, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice tight. It slipped. She turned back to her task, her back to him, hoping he would return to his mending, but she could feel his eyes on her, his steady, patient gaze. He knew it was more than a dropped plate. In the profound silence of their shared existence, a small disruption like this was as loud as a gunshot. The plate, the warm water, the simple domesticity of the moment, it was all too much. The contrast between this life and the one she had escaped was a chasm she could no longer ignore. The story she had locked away inside her, the poison she had carried alone for so long, suddenly needed to be drawn out. The quiet of the cabin, which had always felt like a shield, now felt like a space waiting to be filled. "His name was Silas Croft," she said, her voice so low it was almost lost in the crackle of the fire. She kept her back to Jed, her knuckles white where she gripped the edge of the sink. She felt a terrifying sense of release, as if she had just stepped off a cliff into thin air. Jed remained silent, waiting. He did not prompt her or press her. He gave her the space to let the words come in their own time, on their own terms. "He owned a saloon in Dusty Creek," she continued, her voice gaining a slight, tremulous strength. "An old man, older than my father. He had a belly that spilled over his belt and fingers stained yellow from his cigars. His eyes, they were small, like a pig's, and they were always watching." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "My father, he was not a kind man. His temper was a storm that could break with no warning. His displeasure was swift and painful. After my mother passed, it grew worse. He drank more, and he started to look at me not as a daughter, but as a burden, or an asset." The word tasted like ash in her mouth. She stared down at her hands in the murky water, no longer seeing them. "He arranged the match. That's what he called it, an arrangement. Mr. Croft was a man of means. My father said he would provide for me. It was a good opportunity. But it wasn't an opportunity. It was a transaction. Mr. Croft paid my father a handsome sum, enough to settle his debts and keep him in whiskey for a long, long time. I was the price." She could feel the hot sting of tears behind her eyes, but she fought them back. She would not cry. Not now. "I begged him not to. I told him I would work. I would do anything, but he wouldn't listen. He said a daughter's duty was to obey. The day of the ceremony, he gave me a new dress. It felt like a burial shroud. Mr. Croft gave me a ring. It was heavy and gold, with a gaudy red stone. It felt like a manacle on my finger." She unconsciously rubbed the finger where the ring had been, the skin still feeling indented by its memory. That night, he was not gentle. He smelled of stale liquor and sweat. He told me that I belonged to him now, that my father had been paid in full. He said that a wife, just like a horse or a dog, needed to be taught who was master. The words came out in a broken whisper, like pieces of glass. I learned quickly. She finally fell silent, the weight of her confession hanging in the small cabin. The only sound was the fire, eating away at the logs. She stood rigid, braced for his reaction. Pity, disgust, a barrage of questions she couldn't bear to answer. She expected him to say something, to do something, to acknowledge the ugliness she had just laid bare on his clean floor. Jedediah Mercer did none of those things. After a long, still moment, she heard the soft scrape of his stool on the floor as he stood up. She tensed, her shoulders hunching, expecting him to walk away, to leave her alone with her shame. Instead, She heard his quiet footsteps approaching. He stopped beside her at the sink. He did not touch her. He did not speak. He simply reached past her and picked up a clean, dry cloth from the small shelf. He held it out to her, a silent offering. She stared at the rough, clean cloth in his hand. It was an anchor in a swirling sea of memory. Slowly, she lifted her hands from the water, dripping onto the floor. She took the cloth from him, and their fingers brushed for a fraction of a second. His skin was warm and calloused, a stark contrast to the cold dread that filled her. She dried her hands, the simple, mechanical motion away to keep from falling apart. She expected him to turn and leave then, to give her privacy. Instead, he rolled up the sleeves of his own shirt. He reached into the basin, took the plate she'd been washing, and began to scrub it himself, his movements slow and methodical. He picked up the next plate, and then a cup. He worked in silence, standing shoulder to shoulder with her in the dim lamplight, sharing the simple, humble task. Clara stood frozen, watching him. His head was bent to his work, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. He didn't look at her. He gave her the dignity of not being watched in her moment of breaking. His hands, which she knew could break a man or gentle a wild horse, were careful with the tin plates. He was not offering words. He was offering something more profound. His presence, his quiet, unassuming solidarity. He was not trying to fix her or save her. He was simply standing with her in the middle of her pain, washing the dishes. An act so small, so mundane, it held the weight of 1,000 comforting words. It was an action that said, "I heard you. I am still here. This work still needs to be done. Life goes on, and I will be here with you while it does." She finally understood. Her escape had not just been a single act of running away with a ring and a handful of bills from Silas Croft's cash box. It had been a desperate flight from a world where people were things to be bought and sold, where words were weapons or lies. She had run from a place of noise and violence into this valley of silence. And here, in the quiet, she had finally been heard. A single tear escaped and traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. But it was not a tear of sorrow. It was a tear of profound, aching relief. She reached into the basin, took a wet plate from him, and began to dry it with the cloth he had given her. They worked together, side by side, in the quiet glow of the lamp. And in that moment, as she stood next to this silent, steady man, she thought, perhaps not everyone needs words to understand. The morning after her confession dawned crisp and clear, the sky a pale, clean slate. When Clara entered the main room of the cabin from the small lean-to where she now slept, she felt a profound and terrifying vulnerability, as if her skin had been peeled away, leaving her raw and exposed. She expected the air to be thick with a new, heavy awkwardness. She expected Jedediah to avoid her gaze, to retreat even further into his fortress of silence, embarrassed or repulsed by the ugliness she had shared. Instead, the atmosphere was exactly the same as it had been the day before. Jed was already stoking the fire, and the scent of coffee was beginning to fill the small space. He glanced up as she entered and gave his usual brief, economical nod. There was no pity in his eyes, no morbid curiosity. There was only the same steady, quiet acceptance she had come to rely on. It was as if she had told him nothing more remarkable than that the well was running low. By treating her story not as a shocking revelation, but as a simple, hard fact of her life, he gave her the greatest gift he possibly could normalcy. He did not define her by her wounds. But as the day wore on, she began to notice a series of small, almost imperceptible changes. They were gestures so subtle that, had she not been attuned to the silent language of this place, she might have missed them entirely. The first came at midday. Part of her daily routine was to sit on the rough wooden bench outside the cabin door, peeling potatoes or mending clothes, soaking in the warmth of the sun. The bench was made of a split log, and its surface was uneven and hard. A minor discomfort she had long since accepted as part of her new life. But today, when she went to sit, she found a thick, folded piece of old, worn sheepskin lying on her usual spot. It was not a cushion. It was a practical, rugged piece of material, likely from an old saddle lining. But it was soft, and it was placed exactly where she sat. Jed was in the corral, his back to her, working with the buckskin horse. He hadn't said a word. He had simply observed her small, uncomplaining discomfort and, in his own silent way, had provided a remedy. A wave of warmth, entirely separate from the sun, washed over her. Later that afternoon, she was weeding the small, precious vegetable patch, a task that required her to work for a long stretch under the relentless New Mexico sun. The heat was intense, and the air was dry. She would often find herself parched, her throat thick with dust, before she allowed herself to stop and walk the long yards to the well for a drink. Today, however, as she paused to wipe the sweat from her brow, her eyes fell upon a small patch of shade cast by a juniper post at the corner of the garden. Sitting there, in the cool shadow, was a tin dipper filled to the brim with fresh, cold water. The metal was beaded with condensation. He must have drawn it from the well and left it there for her while she was bent over her work, moving so quietly she hadn't even noticed. He had anticipated her need, had seen her labor, and had met it with a quiet act of foresight and care. These small, silent gestures accumulated over the following days, each one a single, carefully laid stone in a foundation of unspoken tenderness. When he saw her struggling to carry a heavy armload of firewood, he appeared at her side and simply took the bulk of the load from her, their arms brushing for a brief moment. He noticed the sole of her worn-out shoe was beginning to separate, and, the next morning, she found the shoe by the door, the sole tightly and neatly stitched with waxed thread, stronger than it had been before. He was not just protecting her. He was actively caring for her. His attention now focused on the minute details of her daily existence, on the small hardships he could ease without a word. This quiet, constant consideration began to work a profound change within Clara. The hard, defensive shell she had built around herself, a necessary armor for survival, began to crack. In its place, something new and fragile began to grow. It was a feeling so foreign she could barely put a name to it, a strange and wonderful ache in her chest that was not pain, but its opposite. It was gratitude. Yes, but it was more than that. It was a deep, resonant response to being truly seen, perhaps for the first time in her life. She found herself watching him as he went about his day. She watched the surprising gentleness in his large, calloused hands as he checked the horse's hoof. She saw the deep, focused patience in his eyes as he taught Caleb how to set a rabbit snare. She noticed the way he would stand on the porch at sunset, his gaze fixed on the distant, purple mountains, a profound loneliness in his stillness that she now recognized mirrored her own. She began to see not just the strong, silent man who had saved her, but the man himself, a person with his own history, his own unseen burdens. She longed to give something back, to answer his silent language with a gesture of her own. But what could she offer? He was a man who seemed to need nothing. He was as self-sufficient and contained as the valley itself. She could cook his meals and mend his clothes, but those were acts of necessity, of earning her keep. She wanted to give him something that was not about survival, something that was simply for him. The answer came to her one afternoon as she and Caleb were exploring the shallow creek that ran through the far end of the valley, clustered in a sheltered spot where the soil was richer. A vibrant splash of color defied the muted tones of the landscape. It was a patch of wild Indian paintbrush, their fiery red and orange blossoms like strokes from a sunset painted onto the earth. They were beautiful, a small, fierce testament to life's persistence in even the harshest of places. Caleb, who had an intimate knowledge of every plant and animal in their small world, saw her looking. He pointed a small, grubby finger. "Fire on the mountain," he said, one of his rare short sentences. They're beautiful, Clara breathed. On impulse, she carefully picked a single, perfect stalk, its colors blazing in the afternoon sun. It was a fragile, fleeting thing, a piece of wild beauty. She carried it carefully back to the cabin, shielding it from the wind. She didn't know what she would do with it. To hand it to Jed directly felt too bold, too forward. It was a gesture whose meaning was too raw and undefined to be spoken aloud. When she reached the cabin, Jed was inside, and Caleb had run off to check his snares. She was alone. She paused on the rough stone that served as a front step, the flower in her hand. This threshold was the boundary between the wildness of the valley and the safety of the home he had created. It was a shared space. Without allowing herself to think about it further, she gently laid the single, bright blossom on the stone, right in the center, where he could not miss it when he came out. Then, her heart beating a little too fast, she turned and busied herself by the water barrel, her back to the door. An hour later, as the sun began to dip behind the mesa, Jed emerged from the cabin. She heard the creak of the door, and she held her breath, not daring to look. She heard his footsteps pause on the stone step. The silence stretched for a long, agonizing moment. Then, the footsteps continued on toward the barn. She finally allowed herself to turn. The flower was gone. A pang of disappointment, sharp and cold, went through her. He had simply swept it aside. She thought, a piece of errant foliage, a weed left on his doorstep. She felt a flush of foolishness. What had she been thinking? A man like him, a hard, practical man, would have no use for a flower. She pushed the feeling down and went about her evening chores, a new layer of quiet reserve settling over her. She had tried to speak, and her words had been discarded. The easy silence between them that evening felt different, tinged with her own secret hurt. 2 days passed. The small, unspoken acts of kindness from Jed continued, but Clara held a small part of herself back, wounded in a way she couldn't explain. On the 3rd day, Jed and Caleb rode out early, heading for the high country to check on a line of traps. It was a rare occasion for her to be completely alone at the homestead. She decided to use the opportunity to give the cabin a thorough cleaning, a way to keep her hands and mind busy. Jed's few personal possessions were kept on a small shelf beside his bed. Among them was a thick, leather-bound book. It was not a Bible or a book for reading. It was a ledger, its pages filled with his neat, economical script records of supplies, notes on the weather, sketches of animal tracks. She had seen him writing in it many times. As she carefully dusted the shelf, she picked it up to wipe beneath it. It fell open in her hands. And there, pressed carefully between 2 pages of notes about seasonal rainfall, was her flower. It was no longer the vibrant, living thing she had picked. Its fiery colors had softened to a gentle memory of themselves, a delicate stain of rose and orange against the creamy page. It was fragile, preserved, captured in a moment of time. He had not discarded it. He had saved it. He had taken her small, fleeting gesture of beauty and made it permanent, tucking it away within the private records of his own life. She stared at the pressed flower, and the foolish, wounded feeling inside her dissolved, replaced by a wave of emotion so powerful it made her dizzy. He had understood. He had heard the silent words she had left on his doorstep, and in his own way, he had answered. He had told her, without a single sound, that her offering mattered. She gently closed the book and placed it back on the shelf, her touch reverent. The cabin was no longer just a shelter, and the man who lived in it was no longer just her protector. In the quiet language of a folded sheepskin, a dipper of cool water, and a single, pressed wildflower. Something new and profound had been built between them. No promises had been spoken, no declarations made, but in the vast, lonely silence of the valley, they had begun to build a home. The false autumn, a season of cool nights and brilliantly warm, clear days, had settled over the valley. It was a time of deceptive peace, a deep, quiet breath before the true cold of winter arrived. The rhythm of life at the homestead had become a steady, comforting heartbeat. The fear Clara had carried for so long had receded, becoming a scar rather than an open wound, a thing of the past that she was beginning to believe would stay there. This afternoon was a perfect embodiment of that peace. A gentle breeze, carrying the dry, sweet scent of sun-baked earth and distant pine, drifted down from the high country. Clara was at the clothesline, a long rope stretched between the cabin and a sturdy juniper post, hanging the last of the week's washing. The clean, damp scent of the lye soap rose from the fabric. She took a deep, contented breath, her movements unhurried. Each clothespin she clipped to the line was a small anchor, fastening her to this new, quiet life. Nearby, in a patch of dusty sunlight, Caleb was playing. He sat cross-legged, completely absorbed in a world of his own making. In one hand, he held the lopsided wooden bird Jed had carved for him, and in the other, the slightly more refined one Clara had received as his first offering. He was making them swoop and dive through the air, providing his own soft, whooshing sound effects. He was a different boy from the silent, feral creature she had first met. The caution was still there in his watchful blue eyes, but it was now overlaid with a child's simple, trusting contentment. Jed was at the well, 100 feet from the cabin. The steady, rhythmic creak of the windlass was a familiar, soothing sound, the percussion to their afternoon's quiet song. He was stripped to his undershirt, the muscles in his back and shoulders moving with powerful efficiency as he hauled up a full bucket of cold, clear water. The sun glinted off the droplets that spilled over the bucket's rim. It was a scene of such profound, ordinary domesticity that it felt eternal, as if it had always been and would always be this way. It was Jed who felt the first discordant note. He paused in his work, the bucket hovering halfway to the surface. He did not look up. Not at first. He simply went still, his head cocked at a slight angle, a predator's stillness that was utterly alien to the peaceful scene. Clara, accustomed to his every mood and posture, noticed his sudden tension immediately. A cold serpent of unease uncoiled in her stomach. The breeze felt suddenly chill. "Jed!" she called out, her voice soft, questioning. He didn't answer. He slowly, deliberately, let the bucket slide back down into the dark throat of the well. His eyes were not on her, but on the high rim of the mesa that formed the northern wall of their valley. He was scanning the ridge, his gaze sharp and focused, sweeping across the familiar lines of rock and scrub. Clara's hands froze on the clothesline. She followed his gaze, her own eyes searching the distant ridge. At first, she saw nothing but the familiar, empty landscape under the vast blue sky. Then she saw it, a flicker of movement. It was so small, so insignificant. She almost dismissed it as a trick of the heat haze, but then it came again. 3 dark shapes, detaching themselves from the jumble of rocks and skyline, moving with the slow, deliberate pace of hunters who know their prey is cornered. Horsemen. The blood drained from her face, leaving her skin as white as the wet sheet in her hands. The clothespin slipped from her nerveless fingers and fell silently into the dust. Time seemed to slow, to stretch into an agonizing, viscous crawl. The peaceful sounds of the valley, the breeze. Caleb's soft play faded away, replaced by the frantic, roaring drum of her own heart. It was them. She knew it with a certainty that was as cold and absolute as a tombstone. They had found her. The fortress had been breached. The peace was a lie. Jed had seen them too. In the same instant, he broke from his stillness into a blur of violent motion. There was no hesitation, no moment of indecision. He turned, and his eyes, hard and sharp as flint, locked with hers across the sunlit yard. His face was a grim, unreadable mask. "Clara, inside, get Caleb." His voice was not a shout. It was a roar, a raw, primal command that ripped through the afternoon's tranquility. It was the voice of a man facing the ultimate threat, a voice she had not heard since he had pulled her from the speeding train. He didn't wait to see if she obeyed. He spun on his heel and ran, not toward the cabin, but toward the barn. His long-barreled rifle, he had once told her, was always best kept within reach. But his handgun and ammunition were in the small tack room. The sound of his voice broke Clara's paralysis. Terror, cold and horribly familiar, threatened to overwhelm her. But another instinct, one she had not known she possessed, rose up to meet it fierce, protective, and absolute. She turned and scooped Caleb up from the ground, grabbing him under the arms and hauling him against her hip. The wooden birds fell, forgotten, in the dust. The boy let out a startled cry, his small body stiff with confusion and fear. "It's all right," she gasped, the words a lie, but a necessary one. "We're just playing a game." She ran, her worn shoes slipping in the loose dirt, her breath coming in ragged, burning sobs. The cabin door seemed 1,000 miles away. She could hear the thunder of hoofbeats now, a deep rhythmic pounding that was growing louder. Closer. It was the sound of the world ending. She reached the porch just as Jed sprinted from the barn, a Colt revolver now belted at his hip and his heavy rifle in his hand. He was running to intercept, to cut them off, to give her the precious few seconds she needed. "Bar the door," he yelled, not looking at her, his eyes fixed on the 3 riders who were now charging down the long slope into the valley. Clara stumbled through the doorway, nearly falling over the threshold. She set Caleb down and slammed the heavy plank door shut, the sound echoing the finality of a closing coffin lid. Her hands, trembling violently, fumbled with the heavy iron bar. It was thick and heavy, a solid piece of steel that was meant to repel a world of trouble. She finally managed to lift it and drop it into its sturdy brackets with a loud, definitive thud, safe for a moment. Outside, Jed reached the corner of the cabin and dropped to one knee, bringing the rifle to his shoulder in one smooth, practiced motion. He sighted down the long barrel, his body a solid, unmoving bastion. The riders were close now, their faces clear, the stout man in the lead, his face red with effort and ugly triumph, and his 2 brutish companions fanned out on either side. A puff of smoke erupted from the lead rider's hand. The sharp crack of a pistol shot echoed through the valley, and a splinter of wood flew from the door frame, inches from where Clara's head had been. Jed's rifle answered with a deafening roar that was deeper, more powerful. He didn't aim for the man. He aimed for the horse. The lead rider's mount screamed, a terrible, high-pitched sound, and crumpled to the ground. Throwing its rider hard, the other 2 men reined in their horses sharply, pulling back from the deadly accuracy of the rifle. The downed leader scrambled to his feet, cursing, and took cover behind his fallen horse. The siege had begun. Inside the cabin, Clara grabbed Caleb and pulled him away from the door, into the relative safety of the far corner, near the stone fireplace. The boy was crying now, his face buried in her dress, his small body shaking with terror. She wrapped her arms around him, shielding him with her own body, whispering reassurances she did not feel. "It's all right. Jed's here. We're safe." "We know you're in there." "Mercer," came the leader's enraged voice from outside. "You can't hide forever. Send out the girl. She's property of Silas Croft, and we've come to collect." Another shot rang out, this one shattering the single glass pane of the cabin's small window. Clara flinched, pulling Caleb tighter against her. "You'll get nothing here but a grave," Jed's voice called back, his tone dangerously calm. What followed was a terrifying exchange of fire. The attackers, now on foot and using the corral fence and the barn for cover, began to lay down a steady barrage of pistol shots. Bullets thudded into the thick log walls of the cabin with heavy, sickening thumps. Some found the window, sending shards of glass and splinters of the wooden frame flying into the room. Jed was a phantom of controlled violence. He fired, then immediately moved. using the different firing slits he had built into the cabin walls for this very purpose. A shot from the front window, a pause, then another from a narrow opening near the fireplace. He was making his single rifle sound like a small garrison, keeping the attackers guessing, keeping them pinned down. Clara huddled with Caleb, her world reduced to the four walls of the cabin and the terrifying sounds of the battle. The air grew thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Dust and splinters rained down from the ceiling with each impact, with every deafening roar of Jed's rifle. She flinched, and with every answering crack from outside, her heart leaped into her throat. Suddenly, there was a new sound, a heavy, repeated thudding against the front door. Thud! 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 They were using something as a battering ram, a heavy log or a fence post. The heavy iron bar held, but the wood of the door itself began to groan in protest. The hinges screamed. Jed moved back from the wall, his face grim in the dim light. "They're coming through the door," he said, his voice low and tight. He worked the lever of his rifle, ejecting a spent cartridge and chambering a new one. Clara looked at him, her eyes wide with terror. This was the end. The walls were closing in. Thud. Crack. A long, splintering crack appeared down the center of the door. Daylight, and the menacing shadow of a man was visible through the fissure. Jed raised his rifle, his back against the interior wall, his aim fixed on the entrance. He was no longer a distant defender. He was the last line, waiting for the inevitable breach. The flimsy, splintering door was all that stood between their small, fragile life and the violent, ugly death that was hammering to get in. With a final, catastrophic crack, the cabin door splintered and burst inward. Torn from its screaming hinges, it crashed to the floor, and for a heart-stopping second, the doorway was filled with the triumphant, snarling face of the stout man, Silas Croft's hired hound. He lunged into the room, a predator breaching the last defense of its prey. Jed was ready. He had anticipated the breach, his rifle already leveled. But in that same chaotic instant, a dark shape scrambled through the shattered window frame behind him. It was the third man, the wiry one, moving with a weasel's speed. Jed had been caught in a classic pincer, his attention fatally divided between the threat in front and the one that had materialized at his back. Before Jed could pivot, before he could bring his rifle to bear on this new, more immediate danger, the wiry man acted. He didn't fire his gun. He did something faster, more personal. He lunged, grabbing a fistful of Caleb's small shirt and yanking the boy backward. Caleb let out a terrified, strangled cry as he was dragged from Clara's protective embrace. In one fluid, brutal motion, the man spun the boy around to face the room, wrapped a sinewy arm around his chest, and pressed the cold, flat blade of a hunting knife against the pale skin of his throat. The world stopped. The deafening noise of the siege, the gunshots, the shouting, the splintering wood was replaced by a silence so profound, so absolute. It was a physical pressure against the eardrums. The stout man in the doorway froze, a cruel smile spreading across his face as he saw the new, winning dynamic of the fight. Jed, who had been about to fire, went rigid, his finger hovering over the trigger of his rifle. His eyes, which had been burning with cold battle rage, were now wide with a new, terrible kind of horror. Clara could only stare, her mind unable to process the scene. Caleb's face was a mask of pure, uncomprehending terror. His wide blue eyes were fixed on her, pleading. A tiny red line appeared on his neck where the knife blade pressed. A single, perfect bead of blood welling up. "Well now, Mercer," the wiry man sneered, his voice a gravelly rasp. He kept his body shielded behind Caleb's small, trembling form. "Looks like the game's changed. Drop the rifle, slow and easy." He tightened his grip on Caleb, and the boy let out a pained whimper. "I said, drop it!" Jed's face was a stone carving of agony. To be disarmed was to sign their death warrants, but the knife at Caleb's throat left him no choice. With a movement that was filled with self-loathing, he slowly, carefully, lowered the rifle and let it clatter to the packed earth floor. "Now the pistol," the man commanded. Jed complied, his own Colt joining the rifle in the dust. The stout leader stepped fully into the room, his own pistol now aimed squarely at Jed's chest. His eyes, however, were on Clara, filled with a gloating, proprietary leer. "The things a man has to go through to collect what's owed." He grunted. "You've caused us a world of trouble. Girl, mister, Croft is going to be very interested to hear about it." Jed took a small, almost imperceptible step, trying to position himself between the man and Clara. It was a fatal mistake. As his attention was focused on the leader, the wiry man holding Caleb made his move. With a sudden, vicious snarl, he gave Caleb a hard shove, sending the small boy stumbling to the floor. In the same motion, he lunged not at Clara, but at Jed. Before Jed could react, the heavy steel barrel of the thug's pistol crashed down against the side of his head with a sickening, wet crunch. Jed's eyes went wide, a look of pure, uncomprehending shock on his face. A dark line of blood instantly bloomed in his hair, matting it down. His knees buckled. He swayed for a moment, a great tree struck by lightning, and then he crashed to the floor, face down, and lay still. A pool of dark blood began to spread slowly in the dust beside his head. A sound was torn from Clara's throat, a sound she had never made before. It was not a scream of fear. It was a roar of pure, animalistic rage and despair. It was the cry of a creature watching its entire world be destroyed. The wiry man, breathing heavily, kicked Jed's still form. "That's for the horse," he spat. He then turned his attention back to his primary target. Caleb, crying hysterically, was scrambling on his hands and knees toward Jed's unmoving body. The man stepped over the boy as if he were a piece of furniture and started toward Clara. "All right, that's enough of this," the stout leader said, his voice impatient. "Grab her. Let's be done with it." In that moment, something inside Clara broke. The fear, the pain, the years of abuse, the desperate flight, the fragile peace she had found, and the sight of Jed, her silent protector, lying broken and bleeding on the floor, it all coalesced into a single, white-hot point of pure, incandescent fury. The girl who had flinched at shadows was gone, burned away in the crucible of that terrible moment. Her eyes, wild and desperate, darted around the ruined cabin, and then she saw it, lying in the dust, just inches from Jed's outstretched, unmoving hand, was his Colt revolver. She didn't think, she didn't plan, she acted. With a desperate cry, she dove for it, scrambling across the floor on her hands and knees. The wiry man, surprised by her sudden movement, lunged for her, but he was a second too late. Her fingers closed around the cold, heavy grip of the pistol. It was shockingly heavy, an alien weight in her hand, a solid piece of death. She scrambled backward, away from him, and somehow found her feet. She raised the gun, her arms shaking so violently she had to use both hands to steady it. The barrel wavered, pointing wildly around the room before she finally managed to fix it on the man advancing toward her. He stopped, a look of surprised amusement on his face. He saw her tear-streaked face, her trembling body, the sheer terror in her eyes. He saw a frightened rabbit trying to pass itself off as a wolf. "Well, look at that," he sneered, a cruel smile twisting his lips. He took a slow, deliberate step toward her. "The little mouse has found some teeth." He took another step. "You gonna shoot me with that? I don't think so." Behind him, the stout leader chuckled. "Put it down, girl. You're just going to get yourself hurt." Clara's world had shrunk to the space between her and the man in front of her. The gun felt impossibly heavy. Her arms ached, her vision blurred with tears. The iron sights at the end of the barrel were a wavering, indistinct smudge. She could hear Caleb sobbing, a desperate, hiccuping sound from the corner. She could see the dark, spreading pool of blood by Jed's head. The man took another step, closing the distance between them. He was only a few feet away now. He could lunge and take the gun from her in a second. He saw the doubt in her eyes, the war between her terror and her resolve. And then he made his final, fatal mistake. He saw her fear, and he decided to mock it. "You ain't got the nerve," he whispered, his voice a low, taunting hiss. "You're soft, just like he was." He gestured with his head toward Jed's still form. "You won't do it. You don't dare." His words struck her harder than a physical blow. "You don't dare." It was the same unspoken taunt she had lived with her entire life. "You don't dare speak up. You don't dare resist. You don't dare fight back." It was the voice of her father, the voice of Silas Croft, the voice of every man who had ever looked at her and seen a thing to be used. And in that instant, something shifted. The terror did not vanish, but the rage became its master. The image of Caleb's terrified face, the sight of Jed's blood in the dust, the man's sneering, contemptuous face, it all fused together. Her finger, which had been frozen on the trigger, tightened. She pulled. The explosion was deafening in the small cabin, a physical blow of sound that slammed against her eardrums. The gun bucked in her hands with a force that almost tore it from her grasp, the recoil jolting her arms all the way to her shoulders. Acrid smoke billowed from the barrel, stinging her eyes and nostrils. The wiry man cried out, a sharp, high-pitched shriek of pain and surprise. He staggered backward, his sneer of contempt replaced by a mask of shock. A dark, blossoming stain appeared on his shoulder, just below the collarbone. He dropped his own pistol, his hand flying up to clutch at the wound. Her shaking hands had sent the bullet wide of its mark, but it had been enough. He stared at her, his eyes wide with disbelief, as if he couldn't comprehend what had just happened. The mouse had bitten back, hard. The stout leader, who had been laughing a moment before, was now staring at her with a new, sober expression. The game had changed again. This was no longer about collecting property. This was a fight, and the girl, the prize, was now a threat. The wounded man, clutching his shoulder, didn't wait to see what would happen next. He turned and scrambled out of the ruined doorway, his bravado gone, replaced by a panicked urgency to escape. The leader hesitated for only a second, his eyes flicking from Clara and the smoking gun in her hand to Jed's still form, and then to the open door. He had lost a man, and the element of surprise was gone. He cursed, a low, vicious sound, and then he too turned and fled, disappearing into the bright, indifferent sunlight. Silence, thick and ringing, descended on the cabin. It was a silence filled with the smell of gunpowder and blood, the sound of Caleb's ragged sobs, and the frantic pounding of Clara's own heart. She stood there, in the middle of the wreckage, the heavy Colt still held out in front of her, her arms trembling from the shock and the strain. Tears streamed down her face, unchecked, cutting clean paths through the grime and powder smoke on her cheeks. She was crying from terror, from relief, from the sheer, soul-shaking horror of what she had just done. But she was not on the floor. She was not cowering in a corner. She was standing. The gun in her hands was heavy, but she did not drop it. Her legs felt weak as water, but she did not fall. She had faced the monster that had haunted her entire life, and she had not blinked. She had not backed down. The echo of the gunshot faded, swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence of the valley. For a long moment, Clara stood frozen, a statue carved from shock, the heavy Colt revolver still clutched in her trembling hands. The sharp, metallic scent of gunpowder was a bitter perfume in the air. Outside, the sounds of retreating hoofbeats faded into nothing, leaving a ringing stillness that was more terrifying than the noise of the battle. The spell was broken by a small, choked sob from the corner of the room. Caleb. The name was a key, unlocking her from her paralysis. The gun, which a moment ago had been an extension of her will, suddenly became a dead, alien weight. She let it fall, It hit the packed earth floor with a soft, heavy thud. Her entire focus contracted, narrowing to the two figures who now comprised her entire world, the small, weeping boy, and the large, silent man lying broken on the floor. She scrambled to Jed's side, her knees hitting the hard ground. "Jed," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. She reached out a trembling hand, hesitating for a fraction of a second before touching his shoulder. He was so still. A wave of nausea and a cold, gut-wrenching terror washed over her. "Jed, please!" There was no response. The dark pool of blood by his head was still spreading, a terrible, obscene stain in the dust. His face was turned away from her, pressed into the floor. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she managed to roll him gently onto his back. His face was slack, his skin a pale, waxy color beneath his tan. The wound was a deep, ugly gash on the side of his head, matted with blood and hair, but he was breathing. His chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged movements. It was the faintest flicker of life, but it was there. It was everything. "Caleb," she said, her voice sharp with a new, desperate authority. She did not look at the boy. Her eyes were fixed on Jed's still face. "Go to the well. Bring me a bucket of the cleanest water you can." For a moment, the boy didn't move, paralyzed by his tears. "Caleb!" now she commanded, her tone leaving no room for argument. The urgency in her voice cut through his fear. He scrambled to his feet and ran from the ruined cabin, his small, bare feet silent on the dusty ground. Clara turned back to Jed. She ripped a long strip from the hem of her already tattered dress, her hands working with a frantic, clumsy efficiency. She folded it into a thick pad and pressed it gently but firmly against the wound, trying to staunch the bleeding. His skin was cold and clammy. This couldn't be happening. Not here, not after everything. This small, quiet valley had been a haven, a place where the world could not touch them, but the world had found them. And it had left its brutal, bloody signature on the floor of their home. Caleb returned, staggering under the weight of a half-full bucket, water sloshing over the sides. Clara took it from him and ripped another, longer strip from her dress. She dipped it in the cool water and began to clean the wound as gently as she could, her touch feather-light. She washed away the blood and dirt, revealing the true, terrifying extent of the injury. It was deep, too deep. Getting him to the bed was an ordeal that strained every muscle in her body. He was a dead weight, a mountain of a man, with Caleb pushing from one side while she pulled from the other. They managed to drag him, inch by agonizing inch, across the floor and onto his cot. He lay there, utterly still, a fallen giant in his own small kingdom. And so the long vigil began. Time lost its meaning, dissolving into an endless cycle of tasks measured by the rise and fall of Jed's shallow breaths. The world outside the cabin ceased to exist. Her entire universe was contained within those 4 log walls, centered on the still figure on the bed. She was his constant shadow, his unwavering guardian. Every few hours, she would bathe the wound with clean, cool water, her heart in her throat as she prayed for a sign of healing. She tore the last of her wearable dresses into bandages, washing and reusing them. When his skin grew hot with fever, a terrifying development that made her own blood run cold, she sat by his side all through the night, placing cool, damp cloths on his forehead and his chest, whispering to him, pleading with the encroaching darkness to release him. She learned to read the subtle language of his unconsciousness. A slight furrowing of his brow meant pain. A restless twitch of his fingers meant the fever was rising. The steady, faint rhythm of his breathing was the only music in the desolate silence. Caleb, in the wake of the terror, had retreated into a world of his own. He was a small, silent ghost, moving through the cabin with a quietness that was heartbreaking. He did what Clara asked without a word, fetching water, adding wood to the fire. But mostly, he sat on the floor in the corner, a piece of charcoal in his hand, drawing on a small, smooth piece of slate Jed had used for keeping tallies. He drew the cabin, the well, the buckskin horse in the corral. He drew the mountains that surrounded them, their familiar, protective peaks. He drew a world that was whole, a world that was safe, a world where the tall man was standing, not lying broken in a bed. Each drawing was a prayer, a child's desperate attempt to remake reality with lines and shadows. In the long, quiet hours, when Caleb was asleep and the only sound was the fire and Jed's breathing, Clara would talk to him. She would sit on the small stool beside his bed, her hand resting lightly on his forearm, and she would whisper all the things she had never had the courage to say, all the words that had been locked away behind her fear. "You can't leave," she would murmur into the dim, firelit space, her voice thick with unshed tears. "You can't leave us, Jed, not now. Caleb needs you. She would falter, the words catching in her throat. "I need you." She told him about the flower, how she had seen it pressed in his book. "I thought you'd thrown it away," she confessed to his still form. "I was so foolish, but you kept it. You kept it." She talked about his kindness, about the small gestures that had rebuilt her, piece by piece, the sheepskin on the bench, the dipper of water, the way he looked at her, not with pity, but with a quiet understanding that had been a balm to her wounded soul. "I was so scared, for so long," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't think there was any good left in the world. I didn't think there were men like you. You showed me I was wrong. Please, Jed, please come back. Come back to us." Her words were a litany, a constant, soft-spoken plea against the encroaching silence. She would make thin, watery broth from a piece of salted meat and sit for what felt like hours, patiently coaxing tiny spoonfuls between his slack lips, praying that some of it would go down, that she could tether him to the world of the living with this meager sustenance. Each sunrise felt like a victory, a reprieve. They had survived another night, but each sunset brought with it a fresh wave of fear. The nights were the hardest, when the shadows grew long and the world outside was a vast, dark unknown. She kept the rifle, cleaned and loaded, propped against the wall by the door. She would often find herself staring at the doorway, half expecting the brutal faces of her tormentors to reappear. But they did not come back. The valley remained silent, a wounded sanctuary. A week passed, then two. Jed remained lost in the gray, twilight world between life and death. His fever broke and then returned, a terrifying ebb and flow. There were days she despaired, when his breathing was so shallow she had to lean close to feel its faint warmth on her cheek. But she refused to give up. Her own exhaustion was a dull, constant ache, but she ignored it. She ate only when she remembered to, slept in brief, fitful snatches on a pile of blankets on the floor beside his bed. The girl who had been the victim, the one who was always acted upon, had become the fierce, unwavering protector. Then, one morning, something was different. The first rays of dawn were slanting through the shattered window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Clara was bathing Jed's face with a damp cloth when she saw it. A flicker, the barest, faintest tremor of his eyelids. She froze, her hand hovering in midair, her heart hammered against her ribs. Had she imagined it, she watched, her breath held, her entire being focused on his face. It happened again, a slow, almost imperceptible flutter. Then, with an effort that seemed to take all the strength he possessed, his eyelids drifted open. They were not the clear, sky-blue eyes she knew. They were clouded, unfocused, hazy with pain and confusion. They stared blankly at the sod roof above him for a long moment. Then, slowly, they moved, drifting around the familiar cabin before finally, coming to rest on her face. A flicker of recognition, a question. His lips, dry and cracked, parted. He tried to speak, but only a dry, rasping sound came out. She quickly dipped a corner of the cloth in the water bucket and gently moistened his lips. He swallowed, a small, pained movement in his throat. He tried again. His voice was a bare whisper, a ghost of its former strength, so quiet she had to lean in close to hear it. You're still here." The words, so simple, so full of a weary, wondering surprise, shattered the last of her composure. He had not asked if he was alive. He had not asked what had happened. His first thought, his first question upon returning from the great, dark void, had been for her. He had expected her to be gone. He had thought that, faced with the violence and the ruin, she would have run. A great, shuddering sob escaped her, a sound of profound, aching relief that was so powerful it shook her entire body. Tears she had held back for weeks finally came, streaming down her face in a hot, cleansing flood. But as she wept, a watery, brilliant smile broke through. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated joy, a sunrise after the longest of nights. She shook her head, her tears falling onto his hand where it lay on the blanket. She squeezed his fingers, her touch a desperate, joyful anchor. "I'm not leaving anymore," she whispered through her tears and her smile. "This is home. I'm not leaving." Jed's return to consciousness was not a sudden flood of light, but a slow, painful crawl out of a deep, dark well. The first days were a hazy, feverish dreamscape of disjointed images and muted sounds. He was aware, in a distant, disconnected way, of a constant presence beside him, a cool cloth on his forehead, a gentle hand guiding a spoon to his lips, a soft, murmuring voice that was a lifeline in the darkness. Clara's promise to stay was not a passive vow. It was a declaration of war against the death that had tried to claim their sanctuary. She fought for him with a tenacity that was born of a desperate, newfound love. The girl who had been broken became the woman who refused to let him break. As the days turned into weeks, the fog in Jed's mind began to clear. He graduated from broth to a thin porridge, each spoonful an exhausting effort. His strength returned with agonizing slowness. The first time he managed to sit up on his own, the room spinning violently around him. He saw the true cost of the battle. The splintered door had been replaced by a heavy blanket, a poor defense against the cold night air. The shattered window was a gaping hole, a constant reminder of the violence that had invaded their peace. He saw the deep, purple shadows of exhaustion under Clara's eyes, the new, grim set of her jaw. He saw the way Caleb, who now rarely left her side, would flinch at any sudden noise. He saw the ruin they had wrought, and a cold, quiet anger settled deep in his bones. He had failed to protect them. But Clara did not see failure. When she looked at him, she saw a miracle. His recovery became the single, driving purpose of their lives. A new rhythm was established in the valley, one of slow, deliberate healing. The day Jed first stood on his own 2 feet, leaning heavily on the cabin wall, was a silent, momentous victory. He was shaky, his legs unsteady, but he was standing. Clara stood a few feet away, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her face a mixture of terror and hope. Caleb watched from the doorway, his eyes wide. Jed took a single, shuffling step, then another. It was the journey of 1,000 miles, and it ended with him sinking gratefully onto a stool by the table, his body trembling with the effort. Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, and a slow, brilliant smile spread across her face. The rebuilding of the homestead became the rebuilding of the man. The work was therapy, a way to reclaim what had been broken. The shattered door was their first project. Jed was still too weak for the heavy lifting. He sat on the porch steps, his rifle across his lap, a precaution that had become a permanent part of their new reality, and directed the work with his quiet, economical instructions. "The bottom hinge needs to be set a fraction higher," he would say, his voice still rough from disuse. "It'll settle over time." Clara, her arms aching, would adjust the heavy, repurposed planking they were using. Caleb, A serious and important assistant would hand her the hammer and nails. They worked together, a strange and unlikely family, piecing their world back together. When the new door was finally hung, solid and strong, and the heavy iron bar dropped into place with a satisfying thud, a tangible sense of security settled back over the cabin. It was more than a door. It was a statement. They were still here. They had endured. As Jed's strength returned, the dynamic between them shifted once more. She was no longer just his caregiver. She was his partner. They worked side by side, their movements falling into an easy, unspoken synchronicity. He would chop the wood, and she would stack it. She would tend the garden, and he would repair the fence that protected it. Their days were filled with a shared, productive silence that was more intimate than any conversation. The small, tender gestures that had begun before the attack now returned, deeper and more meaningful than before. He noticed the way she shivered in the cool mornings, and one day, an old, heavy wool shirt of his appeared, laid neatly folded at the foot of her bed. It was far too big for her, but she wore it as she worked, the sleeves rolled up, the thick fabric a warm, constant embrace. She, in turn, learned the exact way he liked his coffee, strong and black, and would have a hot tin cup waiting for him when he came in from the cold. One hot afternoon, they were at the well, a task they now often shared. The work of hauling up bucket after bucket to fill the water trough for the horse and the barrels for the cabin was strenuous. Jed would work the windlass, his powerful shoulders once again moving with their old, easy strength. Clara would guide the heavy, sloshing buckets and pour them out. He had just hauled up a particularly full bucket, the water clear and cold, beaded with sweat in the afternoon sun. He swung it over to the edge of the well. "Careful," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It's heavy." She reached out to take it from him, to guide it into the trough. Her smaller, calloused hands covered his as they both gripped the rope handle. And then, for a moment, they both stilled. It was more than a simple, accidental touch. For a single, suspended beat of time, the world seemed to stop. She was acutely aware of the warmth of his skin, of the solid, unyielding strength in his fingers beneath hers. He did not pull away. She did not let go. She looked up, and her gaze met his. His eyes, clear and blue as a winter sky, held an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. In their depths, she saw a reflection of everything they had survived, everything they had become. She saw the quiet understanding, the fierce protectiveness, and something more, something new and vulnerable and overwhelmingly tender. It was a look that spoke of 1,000 unsaid things, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had been forged between them in fear and fire, in silence and shared survival. A faint blush rose on her cheeks, and after a moment that felt both fleeting and eternal, he slowly released his grip, letting her take the full weight of the bucket. He broke eye contact, turning his attention to the horizon. But she had seen it. She had felt it. The unspoken had become a tangible, living thing between them. The seasons turned. The false autumn gave way to the sharp, clean cold of winter. Snow dusted the tops of the mesas, and the valley floor was hard with frost in the mornings. The cabin, with its solid door and repaired window, became a warm, glowing haven against the harshness of the world. They were an island, the three of them, in a vast, silent sea of white. One evening, the chores were done. A hearty stew bubbled over the fire, filling the small cabin with its rich, savory scent. Caleb was asleep on his cot. The small wooden birds clutched in his hand. Jed sat at the table, cleaning his rifle with a quiet, focused intensity. Clara stood by the open doorway. Though she had a heavy blanket draped over her shoulders against the cold, she was looking out at the sunset. It was a spectacular sight, a final, defiant blaze of glory before the long, cold night. The sky was a canvas of deep, impossible colors, fiery orange, soft rose and a bruised, majestic purple. The snow on the ground reflected the light, turning the entire valley into a world of ethereal, painted beauty. A profound sense of peace settled over her, a feeling so deep and complete it was almost painful. This was home. This silent man, this quiet boy, this rugged, lonely valley, this was her world. It was a life she had never imagined, a life forged from the ashes of another, and it was more real, more precious than anything she had ever known. She turned from the doorway and looked at Jed. He had finished his work and was watching her, his expression soft in the firelight. The time for silence, she realized, was over. There was one last ghost that needed to be laid to rest. She walked slowly to the table and stood before him. Her heart was beating a slow, steady rhythm. The fear was gone. "I told you once," she said, her voice a soft, clear sound in the quiet room. "A long time ago. On the train, I told you not to touch me." She paused, holding his gaze. "Unless you meant to stay forever." He did not move. His eyes searched hers, and in their depths, she saw him remember. He remembered the desperate, terrified girl in the tattered dress, the girl who had built a wall of words around her broken soul. And he saw the woman standing before him now strong, whole, and unafraid. He had answered her silent plea for help, her unspoken need for safety. Now, she was offering him a choice, laying her own fragile, rebuilt heart at his feet. He slowly, deliberately, set his cleaning cloth aside. He did not speak. His life had been a testament to the fact that the most important things were never said with words. Words could be lies. Promises could be broken. But an action, a choice made in the quiet of one's own heart that was real, that was forever. He stood up, and the table was no longer between them. He looked down at her, and the tender, vulnerable light she had seen in his eyes at the well was there again, brighter and clearer than before. Then he reached out and took her hand. His grasp was not rough or demanding. It was firm, warm, and utterly certain. He laced his strong, calloused fingers through hers, a silent, binding promise. He did not pull her closer. He did not try to kiss her. He simply stood there, in the warm, fire-lit heart of their home, and held her hand. Outside, the last of the sunset's fire bled from the sky, and the first diamond-bright stars of evening appeared. They stood together, two solitary figures, no longer alone. It was not a passionate, tumultuous beginning. It was something stronger, something deeper. It was the quiet, unshakable certainty of two souls who had found their harbor in a storm, a silent, sturdy foundation for a love that would, from that moment on, dare to call itself forever. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We would be honored if you would leave a comment below and let us know where in the world you're listening from, so we can all share in this experience together. Please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and liking this video. And if this story moved you, please support us further by hitting the hype button, so it can be heard by more listeners like you.